Good evening, welcome to the annual SPERI lecture. My name's Tony Payne and I'm one of the directors of SPERI. And even though I can't see anybody out there at all, I deduce there are a lot of you, and I have to say how thrilled we are to see such a big audience. And I really do want to sincerely thank every one of you for coming and for giving such support to all we're trying to do in SPERI. As I think you know, the annual lecture is our big public event of the year, and we try to select a really interesting speaker who's likely to have something challenging and original to say about the political economy of this very uncertain era that we're all living through. Our first annual lecturer was the Right Honourable Ed Miliband, and his lecture took place in this hall in February 2012. Last year, the 2013 lecture was given by Robert Peston, then the BBC, then the business editor of the BBC, now the economics editor. And tonight, the 2014 SPERI annual lecture will be given by George Monbiot, the writer and environmental and political activist, although I'm not sure that's a very succinct description of all the different things that George is. I don't know what you think, George, about being grouped in this threesome with Ed Miliband and Robert Peston. But then again, perhaps I should ask them what they think about being grouped with George. Although my colleagues will know how of my natural affinity with the world of Twitter, and I can reveal that Robert Peston today tweeted just after lunchtime his admiration for George's latest column in today's Guardian, so they are at least reading each other. Let me say a little bit more about George by way of introduction. As implied then, you'll all know him from his regular column in The Guardian, which he's been writing since 1996. I read it myself because unlike most or many newspaper columnists, I don't ever quite know what George will be writing about and what he'll be saying, but I know it'll be seriously done and well researched, and it'll make me think whether or not I agree with it. And I think that's really George's purpose. He notes somewhere himself, I think, on his website, that he doesn't any longer even agree with all of his columns himself. They're written to challenge us. And all of them are available, actually, on the marvelous website that George has created. And it is a place well worth spending a little bit of reading time. Even by his own account, George happened upon his current role as a commentator and activist in an unplanned way. He's written that he sees life, and I'm quoting here, as a slightly unhinged adventure whose perpetuation is something of a mystery. He read zoology at Oxford and loved his course, but not the Oxford culture. He started making wildlife programs for the BBC, but was then drawn into a series of adventures to Indonesia, to the Amazon, to northern Kenya, during which time he began to engage with really difficult environmental issues. He discovered social movements and he nearly died of malaria. On coming back to Britain, he got involved in protests against road building and the politics of land use. He talked his way into writing some op-ed pieces for The Guardian and gradually found his current niche as a distinctive radical voice, exploring all manner of environmental, political, and economic issues, and usually asking the toughest of questions about our inadequate collective response to them. And books have also poured from George's computer. In addition to early books reporting on his travels and associated political activities, he's also written Captive State, the corporate takeover of Britain, The Age of Consent, Heat, How to Stop the Planet Burning, Bring On the Apocalypse, and most recently published just last year a really striking book called Feral, Searching for Enchantment on the Frontiers of Rewilding. This was a book about large-scale restoration of ecosystems, setting out something, as George himself has put it, that environmentalists could be for, not just against. We're only a few weeks away from the paperback edition, but George has earlier tonight signed some hardback copies of Feral, and these are available at what Blackwell's asked me to describe as a heavily discounted price at the stall outside after the lecture. In short, George is someone who unquestionably we listen to in contemporary political economy, especially if the field is defined as we define it in SPERI, as embracing the impact of severe environmental threat on the whole modernist growth project. He was quoted very supportively in a book that I've been reading over Easter, the best book, incidentally, on the crisis, by the way, that I've yet read. It's written by an American academic called Philip Mirowski, and it's called Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, How Neoliberalism Survived the Financial Meltdown. And George is quoted on page 30 of that book for having written in The Guardian as early as August 2007, and remember that things began to kick off in a big way only really in 2008. George wrote, "We are all neoliberals now." And Mirowski notes that in saying this, Monbiot was eerily prescient. So we're delighted to have you here, George, tonight to deliver the SPERI lecture. And I now welcome you to come up on the stage and speak to your chosen topic.
Tony. Well, thanks so much, Tony, and for those extremely kind words. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. I wouldn't mind a little bit more light on the audience, if that's all right. It's quite nice to see who I'm talking to, if you don't mind, in the box up there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing at the moment the death of that phenomenon with which Tony ended his very kind introduction, both the theory and the practice of neoliberal capitalism. And this is the doctrine which holds that the market can resolve almost all social and economic and political problems. It holds that the people are best served and their prosperity is best advanced by the minimum of intervention and spending by the state. And that through people pursuing their own self-interest, through the invisible hand of that market, we can maximize the general social interest. And to illustrate the spectacular crashing and burning of that doctrine, which unfortunately sort of survives in terms of its doctrinal impacts, even if it's in no way resembles its formative principles. Let me tell you the sad tale of a man called Matt Ridley, who was formerly a columnist on the Daily Telegraph. And then he became, and I think this tells us something about the meritocratic claims of neoliberalism, he became the hereditary chair of Northern Rock. His father had been chair of Northern Rock before him, and as a result of that, that was his sole qualification. He became the chair of Northern Rock, the formerly Building Society and then Bank. And while he was a columnist on the Telegraph, he wrote the following. Let me just dig out this quote here. "The government is a self-seeking flea on the backs of the more productive people of this world. Governments do not run countries, they parasitize them." And he argued that taxes, bailouts, regulations, subsidies, intervention of any kind are an unwarranted restraint on market freedom. So Mr. Ridley, as he was then, was able to put some of that into practice when he became chairman of Northern Rock, and boy, did he do it. And he pursued the market freedom of the kind that he'd been advocating for so long in his columns. And you can see the results today, ladies and gentlemen, on your bank statements. In 2007, Matt Ridley had to go cap in hand to the self-seeking flea and beg it for what became £27 billion. This was rapidly followed by the first run on a British bank since 1878. The government had to guarantee all the deposits of the investors in the bank, and eventually it had to nationalise the bank. Being the kind of parasitic self-seeking flea that it is, in order to prevent more or less the complete collapse of the banking system. By comparison to Mr. Ridley, the likes of Paul Flowers, our poor old Crystal Methodist, were pretty half-hearted. And in fact, about the only things which distinguish Mr. Flowers from the rest of the banking fraternity was that A, he allegedly bought his own cocaine, and B, he singularly failed to bring the entire banking system to its knees. Where's Mr. Ridley now? Oh, we don't call him Mr. Ridley anymore. He sits in the House of Lords as a Conservative peer. That, ladies and gentlemen, is how our system works. And it's not just that neoliberalism has failed spectacularly in that this system, which was supposed to prevent state spending and persuade us that we didn't need state spending, has required the greatest and most wasteful state spending in history to bail out the deregulated banks, which were deregulated according to neoliberal doctrine, and trash the entire economy as a result. But also because it has singularly failed to create this great society of innovators and entrepreneurs that we were promised by the masters of this doctrine, by people like von Hayek and Milton Friedman and the rest of it, who said this is going to create a society of entrepreneurs. As Thomas Piketty, a name which is on everybody's lips at the moment, so adeptly demonstrates in his new book, Capital in the 21st Century. What has happened during this era, over the past 30 years or so, has been a great resurgence of patrimonial capitalism, of a rentier economy, where you make far, far more money either by owning capital or by positioning yourself as a true self-serving flea upon the backs of productive people, a member of an executive class whose rewards are out of all kilter with its performance or the value delivered. You make far more money in either of those positions than you possibly can through entrepreneurial activity. If wealth under this system were the inevitable result of hard work and enterprise, every woman in Africa would be a millionaire. And so just at this moment, this perfect moment of total moral and ideological collapse of the neoliberal capitalist system, a large number of environmentalists stumble across it and say, this is the answer to saving the natural world. And they devise a series of ideas and theories and mechanisms which are supposed to do what we've been unable to do by other means, which is to protect the world which we depend on and everything around us depends on, the living planet, from the despoilation and degradation which have done it so much harm over the past few decades. And this is the pursuit of what could be called the natural capital agenda. The pricing, the valuation, the monetization, the financialization of nature in the name of saving it. Oh, sorry, did I say nature? We don't call it that anymore. It's now called natural capital. And ecological processes are called ecosystem services because, of course, they exist only to serve us. And hills, forests, rivers, I hope you don't call them that anymore. That's terribly outdated terms. They are now called green infrastructure. While biodiversity and habitats, also not at all a la mode, my dear, we now call them asset classes in an ecosystems market. I'm not making any of this up. This is what these things are now being called. And people argue, they say, look, and these are perfectly respectable and plausible arguments, and I don't want to diss them in their entirety, just diss them 99% of the way. They say, look, we're failing magnificently. We're totally, monumentally failing to protect the environment, and we're failing because people aren't valuing it enough. People aren't valuing the natural world. They'll create some road scheme or a supermarket or the motorway service station in Smithy Wood at Chapeltown, right on the edge of Sheffield, which they want to build in an ancient woodland, and they see the value of what is going to be destroyed as effectively zero, whereas they're seeing all the dollar signs associated with the development which they want to put in instead. So if we were to value, to price the natural world, and to say, actually, it's really worth something because it delivers these ecosystem services to us in the form of green infrastructure and asset classes within an ecosystems market, i.e. water, air, soil, the rest of it, then perhaps we'll be able to weigh into that and persuade people who are otherwise unpersuadable that this is really worth preserving. And they also point out that through that agenda you can raise a lot of money which isn't otherwise available for the ordinary kinds of conservation projects. And as I say, these are plausible and respectable arguments. And I think they are the road to ruin, or the road to even greater ruin than we have at the moment. And let me start to lay out why with an escalating series of arguments. I say escalating because they're escalating in what I consider to be their importance, starting off with the relatively trivial and becoming more and more serious as we go along. So perhaps the most trivial argument against this, though it is nonetheless a relatively weighty one, is that in the great majority of cases, the efforts to price the natural world, which lie really at the heart of this whole natural capital agenda, are complete and utter gobbledygook. And the reason why they are complete and utter gobbledygook is that they are looking at values which are non-commensurable. They are trying to compare apples and pears, things which cannot be directly compared. And the result of that is that they come out with stuff like the Natural Capital Committee came out with in its latest report. The Natural Capital Committee is something set up by this government, supposedly in pursuit of better means of protecting the natural world. Though with this government, that sounds a highly implausible proposition. And the Natural Capital Committee produced this report a couple of weeks ago, which said, for example, that if freshwater ecosystems in this country were better protected, the aesthetic value addition of that protection would be £700 million. That's the aesthetic value, i.e. what it looks like, how much we like what it looks like, is valued at £700 million. It said that if grassland sites of special scientific interest were better protected, their wildlife value would increase by £40 million. The value of their wildlife, like the sort of chalk hill blues and the dog violets and stuff which live on grasslands and SSSIs, would be enhanced by £40 million. These figures, ladies and gentlemen, are marmalade. They're finely shredded, boiled to a pulp, heavily sweetened, and still indigestible. In other words, they are total gibberish. But they're not the worst. They're not the worst I've come across. Under the last government, because this started a little while back, the Department for Transport claimed to have discovered, I quote, the true value of time. Let me read you the surreal sentence in which this bombshell was dropped. Forecast growth in the real value of time is shown in table 3. Seriously, you can see it? Yeah, there it was, the real value of time. You can actually see a graph, going up. Growth in the real value of time. The Department for Environment, DEFRA, when it launched the National Ecosystem Assessment in 2011, came up with something equally interesting. It said it had established the true value of nature for the very first time. Unfortunately, it didn't yet give us a figure for the true value of nature, but it did manage to provide figures for particular components of the value of nature. And let me just give you one of these. It said that if we looked after our parks and greens well, they will enhance our well-being to the tune of £290 per household per year in 2060. So what does it mean by this? Well, the well-being is composed of recreation, health and solace, natural spaces in which our culture finds its roots and sense of place, shared social value arising from developing a sense of purpose and being able to achieve important personal goals and participate in society, enhanced by supportive personal relationships and strong and inclusive communities. So you put solace and sense of place and shared social value and personal goals and supportive personal relationships and strong and inclusive communities all together into one figure, and you come up with £290 per household per year. All we require now is for the Cabinet Office to give us a price for love and the true value of society, and we'll have a single figure for the meaning of life. I know what you're thinking, and I know what you're thinking. It was 42, but deep thought failed to anticipate the advent of Strictly Come Dancing, which has depreciated the will to live to the extent that it's now been reduced to 41. It's total and utter gobbledygook. It's complete rubbish. And surely anyone can see it's complete rubbish. Not only is it complete rubbish, it is unimprovable rubbish. You cannot make a silk purse out of that pig's ear. It's just, it's not possible to have meaningful figures coming out of values which cannot be in any sensible way measured in financial terms. Now, there are some things that you can do. They're pretty limited, but there are some genuinely commensurable payoffs to do with the natural world. So, for instance, a friend of mine I was talking to him the other day, he said, what's the most lucrative investment that a landowner can make? And I said, oh, I don't know, probably some new form of agricultural subsidy. And he said an osprey. He said, look at Bassenthwaite in the Lake District, where there's a pair of ospreys breeding. And the owners of the land around it, they have 300,000 people visiting them every year, and they charge them for car parking. And they make probably about £1 million a year from the car parking. Now, you can look at that, and you can say, right, there's £1 million you make from this piece of land by having a couple of ospreys there. Nice work if you can get it. And you can compare it to what you were doing before then, which was rearing sheep on the land, which is only viable because of farm subsidies, because it's a complete waste of time and money. It is in several senses, but in this case, you actually lose money by keeping sheep on the land, at the same time as trashing the environment. It's almost entirely sheep-wrecked in the Lake District. So you've got this direct comparison, and fantastic. You know, the ospreys come out looking very good from it, because you've got two land uses directly commensurable, because both of them are costed directly in pounds. I've got no problem with that at all. And you come out of that and say, there's a powerful economic argument for having ospreys rather than sheep. But these are limited applications. I mean, there are one or two others you can think of. You can look at, for instance, watersheds. And I know that there is an insurance company which costed Pimlimmon, the highest mountain in the Cambrian Mountains, and worked out that it would be cheaper to buy Pimlimmon and reforest it in order to slow down the flow of water into the lowlands than to keep paying out every year for carpets in Gloucester. And again, there were sort of directly commensurable values. You know, the land would cost such and such. You're likely to be able to slow down the flow of water through reforestation to such and such an extent. That would reduce the flood frequency to such and such a level, and you would be paying out less. You know, there were quite a few assumptions in there, but you could pretty well mash it together and come out with a rough ballpark figure, which again is commensurable. But in the great majority of cases, you are not looking at anything remotely resembling financial commensurability or financial measurement. So that is problem one, and that's the most trivial of the problems. So you can see, if that's the most trivial of them, there are quite a few problems here. Problem two is that you are effectively pushing the natural world even further into the system that is eating it alive. And Dieter Helm, the chairman of the Natural Capital Committee, the government's committee, in this same report I quoted from just a moment ago, he said the following. He said, "The environment is part of the economy and needs to be properly integrated into it so that growth opportunities will not be missed." And there, ladies and gentlemen, you have what seems to me the government's real agenda. This is not to protect the natural world from the depredations of the economy. It's to harness the natural world in pursuit of the thing which has been destroying it to such an extent, which is economic growth and everything that goes with it. And all the things which have been so damaging to the natural world are now being sold to us as being its salvation. Commodification, economic growth, financialization, abstraction, all of those things are supposed to be what's going to protect the living planet. Oh, sorry, did I say living planet? I keep getting confused about this. Asset classes within an ecosystem market. Sorry. And it gets far worse still when you look at the way in which this is being done, where almost instantly, as soon as the government's ecosystem markets task force, which is another of these exotic vehicles for chopping up nature and turning it into money, as soon as that reported, it straight away was pushing nature towards the model of financialization. And here's one of the things it said. It talks of harnessing city financial expertise to assess the ways that these blended revenue streams and securitizations enhance the return on investment of an environmental bond, which gives you an idea of what the agenda is, as well as the amount of gobbledygook it's already generating. And what we're talking about, basically, is giving the natural world to the city to look after. The City of London, the financial sector. What could possibly go wrong? Here we have a sector which its wealth is built on debt. On debt, on the creation of debt. That's how it works. On stacking up future liabilities, basically on shafting the future in order to serve the present. That's the model. And then that debt is sliced up, slice, and chopped into all these weird exotic vehicles like collateralized debt obligations and all the things which worked out so well last time round, didn't they? And now nature is to be captured and recruited by the city. They're literally put into the care of the city, as that quote suggests, and given to them to look after. This is utterly insane. But in order for them to extract any value from it, the same task force says, we need to unbundle ecosystem services so that they can be individually traded. And that's the only way in which it can work, this financialization and securitization and bond issuing and all the rest of it that they're talking about. It has to be unbundled. And if there is one thing we know about ecosystems, and we know it the more we discover about them, is that you cannot safely disaggregate their functions without destroying the whole damn thing. That they function as coherent, holistic systems which depend upon each other. The different elements depend upon each other, and their resilience is dependent upon the diversity of systems which come together in an ecosystem. The moment you start to unbundle those and to trade them separately, you create a formula for disaster. Okay, that was problem 2. Problem 3 is something which, well, I assume it must be a very rude word because hardly anyone ever uses it, certainly not in polite society. It begins with a P and it's 5 letters long. And a lot of people who you would expect to come out with it, and perhaps if they sort of drop a hammer on their toe or something they do, don't seem to be able to utter this word. And it is, of course, power. Power is the great issue which in this entire agenda of the pricing and commodification of nature seems to get left out. And because it gets left out, because it gets almost, I think, deliberately overlooked, what we're effectively seeing with the natural capital agenda is the invocation of money as a kind of fairy dust, as something that you sprinkle over all the unresolved problems of power and expect them magically to resolve themselves. But because they're unresolved, because they're unaddressed, because they're even unacknowledged, they are actively disavowed. Not only can they not resolve themselves, but the natural capital agenda cannot possibly work under those circumstances, circumstances which I believe are absolutely integral and inherent to the pricing agenda. So, for example, and to give you an example of where, in principle, a pricing system could work, because you're looking at high commensurability, you're looking at very simple and straightforward outputs, you're looking at quite a simple and straightforward monitoring system, so everything's lined up, all the ducks are lined up for a system which should be able to work, and that's the European emissions trading system for trying to reduce carbon emissions by setting a carbon price or creating a carbon price. And I'm not inherently opposed to it. I can see it's potentially as good a mechanism as any other for trying gradually to decarbonize society, as we ought to be doing. But it has been an utter and total failure. An effective price for carbon begins at about £30 a tonne. That's the point at which you begin to see serious industrial change in response of disinvestment in fossil fuels, investment instead in low carbon technologies and all this sort of energy saving technologies and the rest of it, which we so desperately need to see. Almost throughout its history, throughout the history of the European emissions trading scheme system, the price of carbon has hovered around €5. And that's where it is today. And whatever happens, you know, there'll be a little fillip here of 20 cents, and then it go up and down 20 cents, but it'll hover around €4 to €5. And the reason for that is a very old-fashioned one. It's that the heavily polluting industries, the carbon-intensive industries, which were being asked to change their practices, lobbied very heavily the governments of the European Union and the European Commission and the MEPs to ensure that they received an over-allocation of carbon permits. Far too many permits were issued, with the result that the prices stayed very low. And when the European Parliament started talking about withdrawing some of those permits, they too were lobbied and they caved in and failed to withdraw them, so the prices stayed very low. And what we see here is the age-old problem of power. Governments and the Commission are failing to assert political will. They are failing to stand up for themselves and say, this is how the market is going to function. It's not going to function without this dirigiste, an interventionist approach. And without that dirigiste and interventionist approach, we end up with something which is almost entirely useless. In fact, worse than useless, because I don't think there has been a single coal-burning power station, motorway or airport in the European Union since the ETS came along, which has not been justified with reference to the market created by the trading system. And what's happened is that you haven't changed anything by sprinkling money over the problem. You've merely called it something else. You've called it a market as opposed to a political system. But you still need the regulatory involvement of the state to make that market work. But because we persuade ourselves that we don't need that anymore because it is a market and because there's money involved, we end up fudging the issue of power and not addressing those underlying problems. So to give you another example, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity exercise overseen by Pavan Sukhdev from Deutsche Bank. It's huge, huge exercise, involving a vast amount of expenditure on it, which came out with all these totally bogus figures as to what things were worth. But anyway, came out with one or two which maybe weren't so bogus. And one of the most famous ones was its valuation of mangrove forests. And it said, look, if some businessman or businesswoman comes along and cuts down the mangrove forest and replaces it with a shrimp farm, that will be worth around $1,200 per hectare per year to that person. If we leave the mangrove forest standing, because it protects the local communities who live on the coastline, and because it's such a wonderful breeding ground for fish and crustacean and all the rest of it, which the local fisher folk use, it'll be worth $12,000 per hectare per year, as opposed to $1,200, it'd be worth $12,000 per hectare per year. So look, by publishing the figures, we have demonstrated that it makes sense to save the mangrove forests, not to cut them down. Therefore, this will change the way that things happen. My left foot. People have known for centuries, literally for centuries, the tremendous benefits which mangrove forests deliver. But has that protected them from being turned into shrimp farms or beach resorts or whatever it happens to be? No, it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is that it might be worth $12,000 to the local impoverished community of fisherfolk, but the fact that it's worth $1,200 to a powerful local politician who wants to turn it into shrimp farms, that, when you're faced with the realities of power, is what counts. And putting a price on it doesn't in any way change that relationship. In fact, again, what it does is to create this false reassurance which says, problem solved. You do not solve the problem that way. You do not solve the problem without confronting power. And yet, what we're doing here is reinforcing power, is strengthening the power of the people with the money, is strengthening the power of the economic system as a whole against the power of nature. And let me give you one or two examples of that. Let's start on the outskirts of Sheffield with Smithy Wood. This is an ancient woodland which 800 years ago was recorded as providing charcoal for the monks who were making iron there. It's a critically important part of Sheffield's history and culture. It's full of stories and a sense of place and a sense of being able to lose yourself in something completely different. And someone wants to turn the half of Smithy Wood, the great centre of Smithy Wood, completely fragmenting it into a motorway service station. Now, this might have been unthinkable until relatively recently. But it is thinkable now because the government has introduced something, or it's in the process of introducing something called biodiversity offsets. If you trash a piece of land here, you can replace its value by creating some habitat elsewhere. And this is sort of ties in with this whole element of fungibility, of tradability, of being able to change places of one thing and another, where nature is sort of dematerialized and turned into something which can be traded either in the form of money or in the form of something which is said to have similar value. And what they say is, look, we're going to plant 60,000 saplings with rabbit guards around them in some other place, and that'll make up for trashing Smithy Wood. And it seems to me to be unlikely that anyone would have given that proposal to trash Smithy Wood, this ancient woodland, and build a service station in the middle of it, were it not for that mechanism of biodiversity offsets. So something which the government has tried to sell to us as protecting nature actually greatly threatens nature. Nature as understood by the people who love it as a source of wonder and delight and enchantment, which is what an ancient woodland certainly is for me, and I dare say for many other people in this room, as opposed to little trees with rabbit guards around them planted on the slip road, or, as it turns out, in the path of HS2, where they're all going to get cut down again. And that's just one example. Let me give you another one. Say we decide that we're going to value nature in terms of pounds or dollars or euros, and that's going to be our primary metric for deciding what should be saved and what should not be saved. And this is supposed to be an empowering tool to protect the natural world from destruction and degradation. Well, you go to a public inquiry, and you find that miraculously, while your wood, which you're trying to save, has been valued at X pounds, The road which they want to build through the wood has been valued at X plus 1. And let me tell you, it will always be valued at X plus 1 because cost-benefit analyses for these things are always profoundly rigged. The barrister will then be able to say, well, there you are. There's the metric. It's X plus 1 for the road and X for the wood. End of argument. All those knotty issues to do with values and love and desire and wonder and delight and enchantment, all the issues which are actually at the center of democratic politics are suddenly ruled out. They're outside the box. They're outside the envelope of discussion. They no longer count. We've been totally disempowered by that process. At the moment, we see a phenomenon called green grabbing, whereas forests in the developing world acquire value which is meant to protect them as something to trade off against our carbon emissions here. Local communities are being pushed off those forest lands, and in some cases, the forests are being converted to plantations because there are multiple uses as well as carbon storage and the rest of it. And exactly the processes you're trying to avert are accelerated by this financialization and fungibility of nature. So that was problem 3, or 4. Where have we got to? 3, still the problem of power. But the real problem, and this comes to the nub of the argument for me, is over the issues which I will describe as values and framing. Now, am I allowed to mention Sheffield, Hallam? I've just done so it's too late. In response to an article I wrote vaguely on this issue last week, Professor Lynn Crow from Sheffield, Hallam wrote what I thought was a very thoughtful piece in which she said the following. She asked this question: how else can we address the challenge of convincing those who do not share the same values as ourselves of our case? In other words, we're trying to make a case to people who just don't care about the natural world. How do we convince them, when they don't share those values, of our case? And to me, the answer is very simple. We don't. We don't. We never have. And we never will. That is not how politics works. Tony was talking about Ed Miliband. Picture a situation where Ed Miliband stands up in the House of Commons and makes such a persuasive speech. Okay, this is getting surreal. Makes such a persuasive speech that David Cameron says, you know, you've completely won me over. I'm crossing the floor and joining the Labour benches. It doesn't happen. That's not how it works. That's not how politics has ever proceeded. Except one or two fantastic, infinitesimally rare cases. You do not win your opponents over so that they come onto your side. What you do to be effective in politics is, first of all, to empower and mobilize people on your own side, and secondly, then to win over the undecided people in the middle. But the hard core of your opponents who absolutely do not share your values, you are not going to win over. It's not going to work. That's not how it works. And this is the horrendous mistake which New Labour here and the Democratic Party in the United States have made, where pursuing short-term goals, we've got to win the next election, so we've got to appease people who don't share our values, so we're going to become like them. Instead of trying to assert our own values, we're going to go over to them and say, look, we're not really red. We're not scary at all. We're really conservatives. And that was Tony Blair's message. That, I'm afraid, is Barack Obama's message. It was certainly Bill Clinton's message. Is this whole approach of triangulation, which possibly won elections. So in 1997, a bucket on a stick would have won. But greatly eroded, in our case, the Labour vote across the intervening years. And we've ended up with a situation where there are effectively no political alternatives to the neoliberalism being advanced by the coalition government, where the opposition is, on almost every case, failing to oppose. And it is in that position because it has progressively neutralized itself by trying to appease people who do not share its values. And as George Lakoff, the man who has done so much, a cognitive linguist who has done so much to explain why progressive parties keep losing the elections that they should win and keep losing support even in the midst of an economic crisis and environmental crisis and every other kind of crisis caused by their political opponents, and why still they can't capitalize on them. As he points out, you can never win by adopting the values of your opponents, by trying to go across to meet them. You have to leave them where they are and then project your own values to people who might be persuaded to hear those values and might come over to your side. And that way, which is exactly what the Conservatives have done on both sides of the Atlantic, they've been extremely good at that, especially in the United States, where they basically cross their arms and say, right, we're here, we don't care, we don't give a damn about what you stand for, you hippies on the left. This is what we stand for, and we're going to project it, project it, project it, project it, until you feel that you have to come to us. And so what we've got there is a Democratic Party which is indistinguishable from where the Republicans were 10 years ago. It has gone so far to the right that it has lost its core values. And I think you can say the same about the Labour Party in this country. And that, in effect, is what we're being asked to do through this pricing of everything agenda, where we're saying because our opponents don't share our values and they're the people wrecking the environment, we have to go over to them and say, we like you really. All we care about is money. We don't really care about nature for its own sake. We don't really believe in any of this intrinsic stuff. We don't believe in wonder and delight and enchantment. We just want to show you that it's going to make money. And of course, A, it's not going to work because they'll always, the cost-benefit analysis will be rigged against it. But B, so much more damagingly, we completely destroy our own moral authority and legitimacy and position in so doing. And it was very telling to me, and I was so pleased to see it, that in a recent interview, George Lakoff, who is the guy who really put the formulation of values as the absolute key to political success on the map, the thing which he singled out as making him groan most with utter despair was the attempt to monetize nature in order to save it, where he was arguing that well-meaning people were trying to do the right thing, but were completely failing to apply a frames analysis. A frame is the mental structure which you use to approach and understand an issue, a frames analysis to what they were doing. And as a result, instead of framing it with their own values and describing and projecting their values, which is the only thing in the medium to long term which ever works, they were throwing all those over, surrendering them, and going over to the values of the people who are wrecking the environment. And how could there be any long-term impact of that other than more destruction? Well, let me put it another way. There's another way of looking at this which says the same thing in different ways. All of us are a mixture, or we're somewhere along the spectrum, I guess you could say, between intrinsic values and extrinsic values. Extrinsic values are all about fame and image and money. It's about driving down the street in your Ferrari and showing it to everyone, something obviously I do on a daily basis. It's about having these external justifiers and motivators and seeing yourself in the light that other people see you in and requiring that approbation, that social approbation for your own sense of well-being. Intrinsic values are about being more comfortable with yourself, about who you are, about being embedded in your family or your community, among your friends, whoever you're with, and not requiring that constant show of sort of resource-holding potential, as biologists would call it, as sort of being the big man or the big woman with the hairy chest, in the man's case, showing that you're the alpha male or indeed the alpha female without the hairy chest, in order to demonstrate to yourself, really, that you are worth something, which you need if you have a strong set of extrinsic values. And research in 70 countries produces remarkably consistent results that these values are very highly clustered. So for instance, people who greatly value financial success tend to have much lower empathy than those with a strong set of intrinsic values, much less concern about the environment and the natural world. They tend to have much more of a tendency towards hierarchy and status. These are very, very strongly clustered. But we are not born with these values. They are the product, very largely, of our social environment, our social and our political environment. And what the research also shows is that if you change that environment, people's values shift en masse with that change. So if, for instance, you have what in the United States they dismissively call socialized medicine, and we call the NHS, you have a good functioning health system where no one is left behind, where everybody is treated, that embeds and imbues among the population a strong set of intrinsic values, because you say, oh, I live in a society where everyone's looked after. That must be a good thing because that's the society that I live in, and you absorb and internalize those values. If, on the other hand, you live in a devil-take-the-hindmost society where people, as they do in the United States, literally die on the street because they cannot afford medical care, that will reinforce extrinsic values and push you further towards that end of the spectrum. And the more that spectrum shifts, the more the values shift with it. And people on the right, they understand this very well. Mrs. Thatcher famously said, economics is the method, I'm going to get this wrong, aren't I? Economics is the method, the object is to change the heart and the soul. She completely understood about changing people's values, something the left has never grasped. And if we surrender to the financial agenda, and if we say, oh, this market-led neoliberalism thing is the way forward, then we shift social values, because let's face it, we, and I'm talking about environmentalists here, are among the last lines of defense against that gradual societal shift towards extrinsic values. And if we don't stand up and say, we do not share those values, our values are intrinsic values. We care about people. We care about the natural world. We are embedded in our communities and the people around us, and we want to protect them, not just ourselves. We are not going to be selfish. This isn't about money. Unless you do that, who else is going to do it? And so you say to me, well, what do we do instead? You know, you produce these arguments against trying to save nature by pricing it, by financialization, by monetization, by valuation, by all of these things. You produce these arguments. What do you do instead? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is no mystery. It is the same answer that it has always been, the same answer that it always will be, and the same thing we just cannot damn well be bothered to get off our bottoms to do, which is the only thing that works. In fact, there's three things that work. The three essential keys to all political change, which apply to protecting the environment as much as they apply to everything else, are in this order: mobilization, mobilization, and mobilization. It's the only thing that ever works. And everything else is a fudge and a substitute and an excuse for not doing that thing that works. And that applies to attempts to monetize and financialize nature or anything else, as much as it does to all the other political issues we are failing to get to grips with. Thank you.
George will answer some questions now. We perhaps have a little bit more light people, thank you. And George is going to chair the questions and answers himself, so I'm again going to disappear.
Is there some water? Oh, yes, there is, yeah. Yes, I've got to that point. Sorry, brilliant, fine, thanks. Right, now I'm going to assert my values and go woman, man, woman, man. So is there a woman with a question to start us off? Because otherwise we know what happens. All right. Yes, a woman here. So wait for the microphone, please. Keep your hand up, that's right. Lady with the pink hair. Shouldn't be easy to miss. Okay.
Hi, George.
Hello.
Thank you for a very interesting speech. I've hooked onto your hearts and minds bit, and I totally agree. It's the hearts and minds that have to be one. And this crosses the board, yes, for the nature thing, but with the legal aid thing, where the cuts are legal aid, there's not much money we're talking about that Grayling is trying to save. And what the young legal aid lawyers and those who are trying to save civil legal aid failed to do was win the hearts and minds. As somebody who was part of the Justice for All campaign, they wouldn't allow me to be part of their steering committee because I'm not a lawyer. And that basically is a snobbery that's inherent in the whole thing, and that has to be got rid of if we're going to win on the left, because everyone has a right to a fair trial. Everyone should know their rights.
Thank you very much. Without getting into the specifics of that, I would say a couple of things. First of all, and this is in no sense at all to denigrate the efforts to dam this great flood of terrible things which are coming our way at the moment through this Frankenstein reconstituted neoliberal government which is sort of chopped together out of bits of coalition and still walks despite the fact that it actually died ages ago. You know, this sort of, neoliberalism is completely dead as a practice, but still the ideology is foisted upon us through this elective austerity, whose whole purpose, as Naomi Klein explains so well in the shock doctrine, for example, whose whole purpose is not to save us from the deficit or to reduce our debt or whatever. You could do that so easily through Robin Hood taxes, land value taxation, through the property taxes of different kinds. There's so many ways, through proper enforcement of tax, clamping down effectively on tax avoidance. You could do all of that without a single cut to a single public service. But the whole purpose, obviously, is to do what Thatcher was talking about. Economics is the method, the object is to change the heart and the soul, to change society, to alter the way we think and the way we perceive things, and to shift us further along the extrinsic end of the spectrum. That's what it's about. So let me preface what I'm saying by saying we have to fight that stuff. We have to fight those cuts. People's lives literally depend on fighting those cuts. But at the same time, we must not just fight those cuts. And firefighting alone, and this takes us back to George Lakoff, who I think is such an important voice here, firefighting alone cannot win anything. At the same time as opposing those cuts, which we must fiercely do, we have to articulate our clear value-based alternatives where we say, this is who we are, this is what we stand for, this is where we want to go, and to lay out an agenda and a manifesto which Labour has totally failed to do. I'm showing my political colours in this, but you probably guessed. Labour has totally failed to do because it keeps flinching and it keeps failing to engage with that issue of values. So it will do a little bit of firefighting, absolutely pathetic firefighting, but it won't do that thing of saying, well, there are fires raging, but we actually want to build something which is going to be fireproof over here. And until you do that, until you build that alternative, until you say this is who we are and this is the building in which we live, no one's going to come and join you. It's not going to work. Right, a man towards the back. Right in the middle there at the back with his hand up in the stripy shirt. I hope the people with the microphones appreciate the exercise which we give. So, sorry about all the moving around. Yeah, far away.
Thank you. Hello? Okay, thank you. So, as a campaigner for fossil-free divestment here at the university, I really, really enjoyed your talk. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. But a question that's bugged me for a number of years has been, in a sense, how do we do this? How do we mobilize? And something that I've always thought has been a huge inhibitor to this this idea of mobilization is tackling the mass media, because when huge fractions of the media are controlled by certain very powerful people, and you spoke about power in your talk, how do we fight against something that really does control almost the minds of the population? How do we fight against the mass media?
Thank you very much. Well, it's a very good question, and you're absolutely right to identify them as one of, or possibly the great sticking point. Because, let's face it, the mass media is run almost entirely by billionaires. And billionaires want what everybody wants, which is a better world for people like them. And a better world for people like them is, by definition, a worse world for the rest of us. I mean, the whole neoliberal agenda is to try to persuade us that a better world for billionaires is a better world for everyone else. And look how well it's worked out. And so they are necessarily going to be completely opposed to the kind of agendas that we're talking about, especially this absolutely critical agenda without which nothing else in the long term can possibly succeed, which is leaving fossil fuels in the ground, turning our fossil fuel reserves into an underground national park. That's obviously, so evidently what we need to do. And, this whole sort of disconnect between politicians sort of earnestly imploring us to use less energy at the same time as trying, in the words of the British government, to maximise the economic returns of from Britain's fields of oil and gas. How do those things possibly equate? How can you have one living alongside the other? They just don't work. Supply and demand, this thing which they're supposed to know about, but the only thing they claim to know about is supply and demand. Somehow it doesn't seem to apply to the field of fossil fuels. So how do we do this in the current media environment? Well, we cannot do it through the media with one or two sort of very unusual little pockets of resistance within the media, and parts of The Guardian will fall into that category, not perhaps all of it. Shouldn't perhaps say that, but you know the story. You know the story. There are not many media outlets, and it's true that we desperately need to be even more effective on social media than we are. I mean, it's helping us, but it's not by itself enough. But what I've found with any media, whether it's the mass media that I write for, well, I suppose you could call it mass, or social media, that actually none of it has any resonance unless there's actual stuff going on in the real world around it. That nothing I write is of any value at all unless it's picked up by activists and people start doing stuff. And it's only then that other people say, oh, look, here's something we could join, here's something which actually people are committed to the extent that they are putting their liberty at risk by protesting, because all protest nowadays involves putting your liberty at risk. And then it starts to gain a sense of public seriousness and momentum. And however well something is projected through the media, unless there's a sense that people are out there committing themselves to really making it happen, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how many hits you get. It doesn't matter how many Facebook likes you get. It doesn't matter how many times it's tweeted, unless, as we saw with the Arab Spring, for example, social media was absolutely essential, but it wasn't anything without people occupying public spaces and actually doing stuff and being extraordinarily brave in trying to pursue political alternatives. And I think that's the message. Don't imagine that even if you did have the media in your pocket, that alone would be what precipitated social change. It is mobilization which does it. So keep doing what you're doing, basically, and try to reach people and be confident in doing so. And there's a woman right at the back there, just a little bit behind you with the black T-shirt. Keep your hand up, please, so the person with the mic can see you. Thanks. And then I'll try to come to other sectors. We're a little limited for time. What do you reckon, Tony? 5 minutes. Sorry, so there's a lot to get through, but far away.
Thank you. You spoke, George, about values being determined by our environment. And I've worked in various charities who work in partnership with schools on environmental education. And I'm interested in what you think about, given that values are often entrenched in childhood and in youth, a trend that I've witnessed is the increasing corporate co-opting of education, increasing corporate sponsorship of schools, and as charities are less and less resourced to enrich curriculum with their values, businesses, money still talks, and corporate partnerships corporate governance of schools, an increased focus on getting the skills of, free market liberals on boards of governors seems to me to be a worrying trend that could really have a big impact on the value system of an entire generation, and I'm interested in your perspective on that.
Well, of course, that's absolutely true, and that is indeed the entire point. And again, these people understand it. They know what they're doing. When you look at what the Conservatives are doing and the right in general are doing, the sort of corporate finance right, they are so much more savvy about this stuff. Labour was in power for, 13 years? And what did they do? To change framing and values in school or anywhere else? Absolutely nothing, far from it. They started the whole academization process and all the other destructive trends which now we're seeing come to the fore. And while there's no simple solution, because we've gone so far down that road because there hasn't been any effective opposition, it's yet another example of how absolutely essential it is that you have an alternative sphere of values, an alternative focus of values, which says we want a completely different way of educating our children. And I'd love to see campaigns which, again, get above the firefighting. We need the firefighting too, but step up above the firefighting and say, right, here we're going to lay out an alternative way in which we're going to educate our children. And it's going to be quite a radical alternative. It's going to be radically different to what Gove is proposing. And we're not just going to fight forced academization, and we're not just going to fight free schools and all the other stuff which goes with it, and we're not just going to fight Ofsted, and we're not just going to fight Gove. We are going to actually set something up which Gove has to fight, where he has to respond to our agenda rather than us responding to his. And in education, as in almost everywhere else, we have manifestly failed to do that. And we're in a right pickle as a result. And I completely agree with your analysis. They're getting to them young, and they're going to change the face of Britain if we cannot articulate clear and viable alternatives. And that means alternatives based on our values. It comes back to that same thing. And it also, of course, means mobilization around those alternatives, not just writing them down and putting them out there, but actually agitating to make that change. I'm sorry that's not a very good answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. So let's have a man from somewhere in this section of the audience in the middle or the back, because, yes, there's a man there. Yeah, you got the mic right there.
George.
And then I think we'll have to have one more after that. Yeah, sorry.
George, thank you for the magnetic and potentially inspirational talk this evening. I enjoyed it wonderfully. I think my question is probably linked to the other three. It's linked to mobilisation, and it's linked to what is to be done. I mean, I think you correctly nailed the osmosis of the Labour Party and other institutions. And I think, for me, that's my question. Our democratic institutions for change, to steal a phrase, seem to have melted into air. And the ones that we've had emerge in the last 2 or 3 years seem to be very short-lived. How do we mobilise, is what I'm saying, in what we've got left of a democratic society.
Thank you. Well, I'm often asked by young people, should I vote? What's the point of voting? Because if it changed anything, they would have made it illegal. What's the point of voting? Because who is there to choose between and stuff? And if I vote for the Greens or someone like that, that's going to be a wasted vote, isn't it? And my answer to that is it takes two forms. And let me preface this by saying that voting is only a very small part of the picture of mobilisation. The first is that if you don't vote, you will get royally shafted. Because pensioners vote and young people vote much less, that little amount of money which is available in the public sector is being progressively shifted into the hands of pensioners and out of the hands of young people. And that is an artifact of the higher tendency of senior citizens to vote than junior citizens. So if you don't vote, you're going to get into even worse trouble. But if you vote for, say, the Greens, you draw this entirely random example, what you are doing there is making an entirely intelligible political decision. If you vote for Labour, for example, it could be for a number of reasons. It could be because you really believe in what Ed Miliband is doing. Well, it could be. It could be because you absolutely cannot bear the sight of David Cameron and you think that Ed Miliband is the best means of unseating him. More plausibly, perhaps. But if you vote Green, there's no room for interpretation. Everyone seeing that vote will know why you voted Green, because the Green Party has this very distinctive set of value-based policies which are completely different from those of the other parties. And you couldn't possibly have voted Green for strategic reasons, because with the exception of perhaps one or two constituents, there's no strategic case for voting Green. And that is a source of strength. It's because you could only have voted for them for one reason that people are going to look at that and say, oh, swing to the Greens, that means something. Swing to Labour doesn't really mean very much at all. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't also be thinking about voting strategically to get the coalition out, because it is even worse than the Labour Party. But not as bad as the coalition. That could be Ed Miliband's slogan. But we have to get beyond this short-termism and start to try to build things with the recognition that if you can't get beyond that short-term strategic voting, and I'm giving voting as just one very small example of the mobilization and the change which needs to take place, if you can't get beyond that, nothing in the long term can possibly change. We'll see this ever steadier shift towards more and more conservative and extrinsic politics, more and more conservative politics and extrinsic values. That can't possibly change until you say, no, we want something completely different. And we're actually prepared to sacrifice a strategic advantage to make a clear value statement. And maybe not just the Greens, but other parties on the left which can make that value statement, where you are actually saying, we stand for something here. We're not just voting out of short-term expediency. And then around that, of course, you then build that mobilization of public protest and writing and involvement in your own community, which is a thing which is so lacking, that sustained involvement, building civic structures within the community. That's what we're missing more than anything else. And we often, unfortunately, use social media as a substitute for that. And then you begin to have the roots of a genuine mobilization. A woman from this section, and that'll be the last one, this section or that one. Okay, lady over there in the pink shirt has attracted my attention. Yeah, keep your hand up, please. Yeah, sorry, not pink, it's checked. Checked red, that's the one. There we go, thank you.
I think a lot of political action or mobilisation you talked about should come from things that are really local. And I think within this university, there's a lot of things happening at the moment that are really negative. On this row, we are from the Institute of Lifelong Learning, which has been part of Sheffield University for a long, long time, which in the next year is going to be really reduced to be nothing more than a foundation level for other courses at the university. And that seems to me something that people are tutting about, but not prepared to mobilise about. People think it's a bad thing after, such a strong institute within the university that's about widening participation, which is about adults being able to learn part-time and in the evening. And I think that's something. I think it's about when you see something that you disagree with or you think is counter to your, educational values, is actually doing something about that or getting in touch with people that are trying to do something about that rather than just saying, oh, goodness, that's terrible. And I think that's the difference, isn't it?
Thank you. Well, without getting into the specifics, which I know nothing about, what I would say is that on the issue of acting locally, you are, of course, absolutely right. And this is, again, I think one of the traps of social media, and it comes back to that second question, is that we're constantly projecting ourselves, and I'm a fine one to talk, we're constantly projecting ourselves into the national arena and saying we don't count unless our voices are being heard nationally and unless they're resonating through national arena. But actually, that is not how change really happens. That's not where change begins. You've got to have a solid local base before you can have any impact elsewhere. And you have to build structures. And while, I don't know about this case, so I don't know whether it's something which needs, I won't comment on it because I know nothing about it, but while negative things have to be fought, positive things have to be built at the same time. And it comes back to the theme of the talk, that if we're going to protect the natural world, we have to firstly say, this is what we want to protect and this is why. And this is we want to protect it because we love it. And the same can be said about the case you're talking about. Here's something we want to protect. But it's not enough just to say we want to stop the negative thing from happening. But we want to create something even better than what we've got at the moment. Because unless you give people that positive vision, unless you say to them, this is what we are for, then all you are is against. And if you are against, then you are playing to the agenda of the other side. You're within their value set, you're within their framing of the issue. You are saying it's either we have this thing or this thing happens which the other side is trying to do, or it doesn't happen. That's not enough. It's never enough. You've got to be able to say as well, we don't just want to stop something from happening, we want to build something more than we have at the moment. And that is an essential part of politics, because you then start setting the agenda, and whoever it is who's opposed to you in setting that agenda then has to respond to that agenda. And this is what I'm trying to do with rewilding at the moment, to say, as environmentalists, we've been phenomenally bad at setting the agenda. We've been very good at telling people what not to do. And we need to keep doing that, because there's all sorts of things we shouldn't be doing, like burning fossil fuels or trashing biodiversity or whatever it might be. We've got to maintain that. But that in itself is not enough unless you give people a vision of something better. Because otherwise what we're saying is, follow us and you'll have a slightly less bad world than you would otherwise have had. That is not an inspirational message. What we need to say is, follow us and we'll give you something much better than we've got at the moment. And it doesn't matter what the campaign is, it doesn't matter what the issue is, always there's got to be that. We're not going to be Tory light if you're on the Labour side, for instance. We're not going to be destructive light if you're talking about trying to save nature. We are going to be something completely different, where we set the frame for the debate. Frames and values. And those are the key to effective mobilization. Thank you.
Well, I'll be very brief, because there's eating and drinking and above all discussing now to go on in respect of all that George has said. Thank you, George, so much for a really, really provocative, moving and funny talk. On your website at one point you write that you have no ambitions other than to keep doing what I do. Well, we hope that you keep doing what you do, because we want to go on reading what you have to say and seeing what you get up to. Thank you to all of you for coming to the university tonight. Thank you to the questioners, and thanks to all of the audience for collectively making this a very, very special evening. Let's thank George again.